to the fall of the Roman Empire. So, Alexander the Great had a father, and his father was named Philip II of Macedon. And he was the king of Macedon, which was a kingdom in the north of Greece. Because Greece was not a politically unified country, it was a collection of smaller states. So, Philip II was the king of Macedon, and he said we should unite Greece so that we can have a country that's Greek united so we can defend ourselves against the Persian Empire. So Philip conquered all of the Greek states, and it was a collection of mostly cities like Athens, Corinth, and Sparta. Sparta gave him the most trouble, so much that Sparta tried to become independent of his rule in a revolt. But because Philip had conquered Greece, his next plan was to conquer the world. He decided, well, now that we've got all the Greeks together, now we should just go and conquer the world. But Philip died. I can't remember exactly how, but he died relatively early. So he had a son, and his son's name was Alexander. You may have heard of Alexander the Great. And Alexander would go on to complete Philip's dream of world conquest. And Philip had some very revolutionary ways of conducting warfare. He had a formation called the phalanx, which is where they had about maybe 100 or so guys get into a square, and they had these long spears called a sarissa. And these were about 8 to 12 feet long. So they basically created an impenetrable formation with these guys all pointing their spears in the same direction to make a wall. And then also he invented the ballista, which is a big crossbow, and some other things that basically made his army undefeatable. And he lived during the pre-Christian epoch, so this was before Jesus arrived on the scene. So about 300 BC is where our presentation starts. So his son was actually the third Alexander who was the ruler of Macedon. There were two of them before, but they're so far back in history, we don't have a lot of records as to who they actually were. But he was Alexander the Third. And if you'll believe this, Aristotle was his teacher. Can you think about that for a second? If you had Aristotle as your teacher, you know, the Aristotle. So now that his father had conquered most of European Greece, which is the areas of Greece that were on the left side of the Bosphorus Strait, he moved into Turkey, which was not Turkey back then, it was called Asia Minor, and it was also occupied by Greek people at that time.
Look at the microphone. It keeps going in and out.
Oh. All right. Oh. Okay, all right, sorry.
It's a little loose.
Yeah. So he conquered Thrace, which is now Bulgaria, and then he moved across the Bosphorus Strait into Asia Minor, which is now Turkey. It's the peninsula that's the most westward part of Asia. So he moved into Asia Minor and conquered it without any major resistance. And he continued his conquests until he reached the Indus River. So he went from Greece all the way to India. He conquered the entire Persian Empire, which was quite a feat. And to add on top of this, he never lost a single battle. He had a victory in all of them. And I could go into all of his different battles and things, but that would take quite a bit of time. But suffice to say, Alexander was no slouch. He was, quite the conqueror. However, Alexander died relatively young at the age of 32, probably due to an infection. That's how it was back then. But after he died, his empire fell apart, and his generals took over different areas of the empire. But the most important of these successor states was the Egyptian kingdom. which was taken over by his general Ptolemy, creating a new kingdom in Egypt, which was the Ptolemaic kingdom, and it introduced Greek culture to Egypt. So, here we go. This is a map of his, oh, sorry about that. There's a map of his conquests. As you can see, we have Greece all the way over here. And he conquered Asia Minor, moved into Persia, also Egypt too, right there, and goes all the way to India. This is an unprecedented conquest. Even today, nobody could imagine this. It was absolutely nuts. So, by his creative use of the tools of warfare given to him by his father, he conquered the world. And it wasn't like he was this commander who just sat at the back of the battle, watching everything. Alexander charged in there himself, fighting in hand-to-hand combat alongside his soldiers. So it's not like he was a coward either. So now we should talk a little bit more about the Greeks, how they were as a people. So they were probably the most scientifically and culturally advanced people in the ancient world. They were masters of philosophy, mathematics, sculpture. You know, they had all of these famous names we still talk about today, like Pythagoras, who invented all this fancy math that makes my head hurt. He's giving me a hard time in geometry class. They invented democracy, which I will put in quotation marks, because this democracy is not exactly the American Republic that we live in. It's basically how Athenian democracy worked is that they got together all the guys, no girls allowed, unfortunately. And they basically said, all right, guys, today we're going to be voting on if we should go to war with Sparta. And then they basically have two pots. They would have the yes pot and the no pot. And they would say, all right, guys, I'm going to give you a bunch of rocks. Each guy gets one rock. Put your rock in the yes bin or the no bin. And then they would count how many rocks there were in each bin. If all the guys said, yes, let's go to war with Sparta, oh my God, let's, they were aggressive to go to war with Sparta, then they would go to war with Sparta if there were more rocks in the yes bin. If there are more rocks in the no bin, no war with Sparta. Of course, they were masters of construction. They built the most impressive buildings of the ancient world. You know, they constructed the Parthenon, their amphitheaters, and I have actually visited many of these. I've been to Greece myself, and I've been to quite a few of these ancient buildings. They're impressive. They're huge. You wouldn't have known that people would have been able to build that with, without excavators or modern, power tools and things. But they're huge. And I'll have a couple of pictures for you in the next slide. The majority of the wonders of the ancient world were built by Greeks. You have the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, which was one of the largest constructions ever. You have the Colossus of Rhodes, which was a giant statue on the island of Rhodes that had the entrance to the harbor on the Greek island of Rhodes was overlooked by this massive bronze statue, and nobody thought you'd ever be able to build that big of a statue. But it doesn't stand today. It was lost. And then also there were a couple other ones, but those are my two favorite ones. And also they wrote lots of drama and some famous comedies and histories and tragedies. Those were all plays. They were very into their plays. It was quite a spectacle to go and watch a Greek drama. But in fact, we still have a couple of them preserved with us today that you can actually read. I can't think of a lot of them off the top of my head, but I do know there's one called The Clouds, but I don't remember what it's exactly about, which is disappointing. I'm sorry. But they certainly did like their plays. That was the ancient Greek version of going to watch a movie, was going to the amphitheater to watch a play. So these are some pictures of me and my brother at the Parthenon, which was a big temple in Greece. It overlooks the city of Athens. It's on this massive hill, and it was quite a hike to get up there. But basically, it's about, I can't remember exactly how long it is, but it's very long, and those pillars, the pillars are constructed by, basically, they had a bunch of artisans, cut them out with hammers and chisels. And these wheels, they look like wheels. In fact, they have a couple of knocked over pillars so you can see the different segments of the pillar, they fell to the side over the years. And they basically stacked them on top of each other and then smoothed it out from there so that they look like solid pillars, but they were really just stone wheels stacked on top of each other. That's my brother, Caleb. He's nice. I don't know what to say about him, but there's quite a few people visiting the Parthenon that day. It's a very popular destination.
What did they do there? What was in the Parthenon?
Well, it was a temple, so they went and worshipped all of their Greek gods that you probably heard of, like Poseidon and Zeus and all of them. Oh, yeah?
Yeah, was there some sort of cement created at that time to hold
So
it together?
it was not held together by anything. Gravity was what held it together, which is why they had knocked over ones that were just like they'd been tipped over somehow. And a little later on, moving past our time period that we're talking about, the Parthenon was turned into a Christian church when Christianity arrived in Greece. But when the Ottomans conquered Greece, they destroyed that. They turned it into a mosque. Then they retired its use as a mosque and they turned it into a powder magazine for their cannons because they had a fort. They turned the Acropolis, which is the hill that the Parthenon was constructed on, into a fortress. But when Athens was under attack by the Venetians, a stray cannonball flew inside the Parthenon and blew up the powder magazine. Now, what's so miraculous about that is that the building did not get completely destroyed. But the reason why the Parthenon looks like that today is because of the explosion, which was absolutely devastating. But it's a miracle that the pillars are standing anyway. Only a couple of them got knocked over. But the roof did come down.
What's on the top left?
I was going to get to that. So this is what a Greek amphitheater looks like. It is acoustically a masterpiece because the actors talking down at the bottom, standing on the stage, could be heard all the way from the back row. So like if you're watching one of their plays and they're going like, you can hear them all the way from the back row of the theater, which was an engineering marvel. I don't know how they figured that out. But, and then it has a back wall, because that used to be an enclosed building, but over the years the building fell away. But it used to be indoors. So that's what remains of the actual walls of the building.
Was the amphitheater in?
Yes, it was indoors. It was like an indoor theater. So we're going to talk about Egypt a little bit. So ancient Egypt has about 3 different distinct kingdoms. There were 3 eras. There was the Old Kingdom, which is the earliest era that they had written language of some sort, so we could actually find records of what they were doing. The Middle Kingdom was kind of the middle part of ancient Egypt. In the Middle Kingdom is when they actually started building the more impressive pyramids, because the original pyramid was for a pharaoh who was called Djoser, and it is basically just, it's not very impressive. It looks like the staircase, just built in 4 different directions facing the same way. It's a step pyramid. It's not like the Great Pyramid of Giza or the Red Pyramid or even the bent one. So Egypt had a complex urban civilization. It was However, still majority rural. Most people lived on farms along the Nile River, and then only went to town to sell their crops. But the economy was basically based on agriculture, because basically what they organized their lives around was when the Nile River was going to flood. And when the Nile River flooded, it brought rich soil into their farmlands. So that's how they managed to survive. And everything along the Nile River, going all the way down there, was considered to be part of ancient Egypt. But if you went out into the desert, you wouldn't find anybody, it's just the desert. So basically their entire civilization relied on the Nile River. Their religion, which I'm sure you've heard at least something about, was all about worshiping the pharaoh, because the pharaoh was supposed to be the son of the sun god. And when the pharaoh died, they mummified him, because they thought that your body had to be mummified if you were going to make it to the afterlife. So they basically invented embalming to make sure that the pharaoh was going to make it to the afterlife. But you didn't have to be a pharaoh if you wanted to be turned into a mummy after your death. It was just an expensive process, so rich people also paid to be turned into mummies. And the pyramids were constructed to be the tombs of the pharaohs, and so that their bodies wouldn't be tampered with after they were died. Their military was one of the most advanced in the ancient world. They basically relied on chariots as their main weapon of attack. And they had blades on the side of the chariots, so that when they were running people down in their chariots, the blades on the sides of the wheels would cut people down. It was brutal. But they also liked bows and shooting bows while they were in chariots. It was quite fascinating. And they had a writing system called hieroglyphs. And they wrote them on tablets originally. And the writing that we have from the Old Kingdom is mostly tablets. But they also invented paper, which was called papyrus. And basically what papyrus is that you take the inside of a reed, the pith of the inside of the reed, you squish it down, and then you let it dry out, and that's how it was made. But eventually they moved on from writing using pictures, which is what hieroglyphs were, and they invented a script that was called Demotic, which was adopted from the Greek alphabet. But that was during the New Kingdom, the very late period of ancient Egypt. What? Is it still working? Okay. Sorry.
Connor, what was the years of the Old Kingdom versus the Middle Kingdom versus the New Kingdom?
Well, I can't remember, but I know that the Old Kingdom was like 2 millennia before 2 millennia BC is the furthest back that the Old Kingdom goes. The Middle Kingdom was lasted about maybe a couple hundred years, and then the New Kingdom was the last one, which got conquered by Alexander. I'm sorry I couldn't remember that. But they had advanced medicine because their doctors were always trying to figure out how they could make people live forever. They were rather obsessed with that, which is why they had mummification and all these things.
What was some of the advanced medicine?
So they figured out that, I'm trying to remember here. They figured out how to fix broken bones. They figured out that if you had the guy, not move his arm so much, maybe it would heal, just have him lay down for a while. They didn't invent casts. They had to hold his arm in place with braces and have them rest for quite a while, but they figured out that broken arms can actually heal. So they didn't have to amputate broken arms. Their tools, their tools were mostly based on bronze. They hadn't invented ironworking, because the Iron Age would arrive significantly after the end of the Old Kingdom. And they mostly preferred bronze tools anyway, because there's a lot of iron mines in Egypt. And ancient Egypt was ended by Alexander's conquests. And that ushered in the Ptolemaic era, which is considered to be separate from ancient Egypt due to the influence of Greek culture. So, going back to Alexander, I hate this thing. Going back to Alexander for a little bit is Hellenization, which is when Alexander was conquering the world, he made sure to bring Greek culture everywhere with him. And this extended from all the way from Asia Minor to India. So they adopted Greek as the language of the world, pretty much the way English is now, as the universal language of the world, really. Egypt's upper class became very obsessed with emulating the Greeks during the Ptolemaic era. So they started trying to mix the Egyptian religion with the Greek one and adopting Greek language and culture. However, it was basically everybody else's upper class that decided that it was cool to emulate the Greeks after they had been conquered. Changing their names to sound more Greek and, adopting the Greek religion and things. And even in India, which is what this illustration is, that's a picture, well, not a picture, a statue of the Buddha, but done in the style of a Greek statue. And much further later, when the British were in India, they were looking at these statues of the Buddha and those other things from the area of India that Alexander had reached. And they're looking at these, and they're like, hey, those remind me of Greek statues. And they're like, yes, those are influenced by Greek statues. They're from the era of Alexander. So they thought that was quite interesting to find something that was related to Alexander all the way in India. That's how long-lasting and far-reaching the influence of Alexander was, is that even many millennia and centuries later, you could still find, statues being made in the style of the ancient Greek ones. However, when Alexander died young, the process basically started slowing down, and eventually it just fell out of favor, and Hellenization stopped. And the only place where Hellenization really continued was Parthia, which was located in what is now Iran, and Egypt, which continued to emulate Alexander and Ptolemy for a very long time.
Why is it called Hellenization? Where's that?
Because in the Greek language, their ethnonym, they call themselves the Hellenes. They don't call themselves the Greeks. That's what the English have invented for them. So basically, when we say Hellenization, it basically just means making them Greek. The Middle East was also rather complicated, like talking about things that aren't Greek for a second. The Phoenicians invented the alphabet. No, I'm serious. So the Phoenicians were a group, a tribe, that were living, that were living on the east coast of the Mediterranean, in basically what is now Lebanon. And they loved to go they loved to go seafaring. They invented boats that were very good, and they traveled around the rest of the Mediterranean and created colonies. And they created one colony that was so awesome it made other colonies, and that one was called Carthage. And we're going to talk about Carthage pretty soon. But eventually the Phoenicians started to die out, and they went away for some reason. We still haven't quite figured out what made the Phoenicians go away, but they invented a writing script that would later be stolen by the Greeks, and they improved it. And that's where the Greek letters come from.
Did you mean they died out?
Their tribe stopped existing. It was assimilated into other
They
groups.
didn't move?
They didn't move anywhere else. Well, they did move at other places like Carthage, but the original Phoenicians living in Lebanon went away. They just stopped existing. We don't know where they went really, but they were probably just conquered and assimilated into somebody else. But so their language went around the Mediterranean and Carthage basically became the new capital of the Phoenician civilization. The Persian Empire was huge. It stretched from, well, India to Asia Minor, but of course it got conquered by Alexander and then stopped existing. But one of Alexander's successor states, by his generals, it was taken over by his general Seleucus, and Seleucus made the Seleucid Empire, which was the successor to the Persian one, and that became the Neo-Persian Empire. Also, this little group of people you might have heard of called the Israelites, yeah, you know, from the Bible. They have a kingdom on the east coast of the Mediterranean, which is, you know, Israel. That existed. You know, their whole story is in the Bible. And then there's Babylon, which was it was variously throughout history either independent or part of the Persian Empire. You know, it was the world's largest city back then. And they had a wonder of the world there called the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which you might have heard of. And what the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were, essentially, imagine a jungle, but in the middle of the desert. How could that be? Well, so basically what happened was, and we're not really sure how exactly they accomplished it even today, but they have two rivers in Mesopotamia called the Tigris and the Euphrates. And these rivers are what basically gives life to the entire region. Without it, Mesopotamia would basically be a barely inhabited desert. But Babylon was constructed along one of these rivers. I can't remember if it was the Tigris or the Euphrates, but they took the water from the Tigris and the Euphrates, and they used the water to essentially create a jungle out in the middle of the desert. And I don't know why you choose the word hanging. I don't think hanging was the right word, because it wasn't hanging from anything. It was essentially a giant step pyramid, but like massive. It was like a huge building, and it had plants going all along the side of it. And the reasons why we know about this is because plenty of people who were visiting Babylon wrote about these hanging gardens and remarked that they were the most amazing thing they had ever seen. And the way that they moved the water up this building is not with an Archimedes screw. That would be invented centuries later by, you know, who else? Archimedes. What instead they had was a device called the shaduf, which is basically a bucket on the end of a stick. And they would have a water reservoir that was also being brought up by these. Basically, there were fellows who would just stand there all day, moving water up with a bucket on a stick. Imagine being paid to stand there all day, or probably not paid, they were probably slaves. Imagine being forced to stand there all day and just do nothing but pick up water, dump it in a reservoir all day. And that's how they kept the place watered. But, you know, obviously it's impossible to sustain something like that forever. So eventually the Hanging Gardens of Babylon went away, and we don't know what happened to them. But they just disappeared. You can't keep something like that forever. But it was a majestic sight for when you did see it, if you were alive to see it.
Is the building still there?
No, Babylon was destroyed, so it doesn't exist anymore.
Who destroyed it?
I can't remember. Oh God. I think it was the Persians or something. I can't remember, but Babylon doesn't exist anymore. And then the last part of the Middle East that I'm going to talk about is Arabia. And Arabia at this time was a barely inhabited backwater with, you know, it was sparsely populated by nomads, except for the coast. They had a couple cities on the coast. And if you know, we're going to go a little bit outside of our period today, just a little bit. Islam originated in one of these cities near the coast called Mecca, and then there was also one called Medina, and the whole story with Muhammad, you know, I'm not going to talk about that. But Arabia before Islam was essentially a backwater that was barely inhabited. And the only reason why people bothered living there is because they could get spices that were brought to them by boats from India, and they could sell them to everybody else. And that was how Arabians made their living, was selling spices to people. However, now we're going to get to the real meat of the presentation, the Romans. What? Oh, sorry, I thought you had something you wanted to say. So this town in the middle of nowhere in Italy called Rome starts getting really big. This starts happening around the 200s BC or so, when Rome really starts taking off. Rome's rise is exponentially short compared to a lot of the other civilizations of the ancient world. But basically how Rome did this is that they invited people from other countries to come in when they had good skills, and they said, hey, we want you to come to Rome. Like all these Greek architects, they invited them to come to Rome and build a lot of buildings and things. So Rome basically started as a society of disparate people from different places coming together. So they love constructing buildings. They got that idea from the Greeks. Rome's basically, the philosophy behind Rome, the main one throughout history is, we're going to take everybody else's ideas and make them better. And that they were very good at. So they also had Latin, which was their language, because they were from a region called Latium, which is in central Italy. And the Latin language would eventually reach parity with Greek as the most high civilized languages of the ancient world, which Latin still retains quite a bit of its prestige today. If you know a guy who knows Latin, he's probably very smart. So initially they're just copying the Greeks a lot, taking their ideas about philosophy. They even stole their religion and just renamed their gods to Latin names and these things. And however, Rome started to do things in a more original way. What now? Okay, sorry. They started to do things in a more original way later on, but in the early period of the Roman Republic, they're just copying the Greeks a lot and putting a Latin coat of paint on it. So their religion was the same general polytheistic types that were prevalent in the ancient world before Christianity. You probably heard a lot of these ones like Mars and Jupiter and Venus and all these, the ones we named our planets after. I still don't know why we chose that, but they're basically, what Rome did is that what they wanted to increase their population. So what they did is that they accepted exiles from other places. So if you get exiled from your, wherever you're living, you should go to Rome. Rome's taking anybody. And their government is a res publica, or a republic. So instead of having a monarch, they basically got a bunch of guys together and said, all right, you guys are representing the people. Even though mostly the senators didn't represent the people and just acted in their own interests. However, a lot of people later on in history are going to get the idea that the Roman Republic is something worth copying, which, spoiler alert, a lot of these republics fail. Although I have some pictures from when I was in Rome. So this is a picture of the outside of the Pantheon, which was a temple. And what's so special about the Pantheon is that it has this massive concrete dome. And this concrete dome is so impressive because it's the largest freestanding concrete structure in the world. And it doesn't have any rebar or anything holding it up or reinforcing it. It's pure concrete. And how the Pantheon's dome supports itself is that it's supported by its own weight. And it has a hole in the middle so that it can let the light in, because they didn't have really any kind of artificial lights back then. You relied on the sun, or if you had a candle or something else that burned. So what they figured out is to light the interior of such a massive structure, they should just make a hole in the ceiling to let in all the light. And it served as a temple for the Roman gods, but when Christianity came along, they, just like a lot of the Roman temples, they converted it into a church, and it's still a church today. I couldn't go in though, it wasn't open when we were around there. And then over here is of course a building that everybody has seen, which is the Colosseum, which is one of the most impressive structures in the history of the world, in my opinion, because it too is completely made of concrete, basically. Only a couple of its structures are made of bricks, but most of that is poured concrete. Anyway, sorry. My mask was touching the microphone there. So in here they would have essentially the most entertaining carnage the world has ever seen in there. So basically what the Roman Emperor, I don't remember, I think it was Hadrian who built the Colosseum. I probably might be, am I wrong on that?
I think it's right.
Okay, sorry. I think Hadrian built it. But basically he said, all right, I need something that will keep the Roman people distracted, and so that they'll like me a lot. So he said, all right, what if we built a Greek amphitheater faced on the other side by another Greek amphitheater? It'll have the best seats, and it will have the most seating space. It was able to hold many thousands of people in there when the whole thing was still full, and because it was destroyed over the years when it was being plundered for building materials. So half of it, the outside part is missing. That was taken away over the years to serve as building materials for other projects.
What kind of presentation would go on in that?
Oh, I was going to get to that. So what they had was executions. You could watch people getting killed for crimes. Gladiators, which of course I'm going to talk about gladiators for a little bit because I think they're very interesting. So, but gladiators were essentially people who were enslaved. Well, we're going to be honest about that. They were slaves. But they were different from other slaves in that they were expected to be able to purchase their freedom if they survived. When gladiator fights were not usually to the death because their owners didn't want their property to be destroyed because they needed the gladiator to return their investment. So usually gladiator fights were non-lethal, and if a gladiator did kill the other gladiator, sometimes he was held responsible for it and charged with a crime of murder. But the gladiators lived at the Colosseum. They had quarters underneath the building where the gladiators would live and get ready to fight, and they would have them pulled up. I think it was like on some kind of rope elevator or something. They would have them be pulled up, and then they would enter the arena. And also they would fight animals in there. They would have animal-on-animal fights, gladiator-on-animal fights. It was crazy. And then the most impressive thing of all they did in there was that it was able to be flooded. They would bring in ships and have the ships fight each other. Have a mock naval battle. It was, can you imagine that? You're going to the Colosseum, and they're like, today we will be having a naval battle, introducing this ship versus this ship, and then the whole arena floods, and they open the floodgates, and they have water from the Tiber River rush into it. That would be crazy. And then you watch the fight. But also in there, when Christianity came around, you might have heard about this, but they executed Christians in there en masse, fed them to lions and all these horrible things. But the great irony is that once Rome had converted to Christianity, they turned the Colosseum into a massive open-air church. So a place where they had been executing Christians for centuries had been turned into a church overnight. But that's the Colosseum. And then also, when I was in there, I don't have pictures of this in the presentation, but I have pictures of the spot where the Roman emperor would stand. So they have the private box there, which is very high above the viewing area, it's like the floor area, and the floor has gone away because the floor of the Colosseum was actually wooden boards standing over the underground part. And they would have sand put on top of the boards. And then when there was blood on there, they would just wipe away the sand and put down new sand. Also they had trap doors and things where they could send up animals. And then the animals would get off, and then they would close the trap door and bring down the elevator. So they would have animals appear during the shows, and then they would close the door. It was like a door in the floor. It's just the most impressive thing to hear about. Unfortunately, you can't see it because it's a ruin now, but if you actually go in there, it looks like a giant pit, but they still have some of the walls from the underground area still standing. But anyway, next slide is Carthage, which I had mentioned earlier, which started out as a Phoenician colony, but as Phoenicia eventually went away, Carthage appeared and dominated the Punic-speaking world. Now, what does Punic mean? Well, you see, the Romans, what they called Carthaginians, they called them Punic. I don't remember what the word is, but the Roman Latin word for Carthaginian people, or Phoenicians, is Punici. So when we're talking about them, we sometimes use that adjective. It's located in Africa, around, I think there's a modern city that is actually built on the same, it's located in the same place as Tunis nowadays, but you can still go to some of the ruins that may still exist. But there's not a lot of ruins left, and I'll get to why that is. But they were mostly based on trade over the water. They had the most advanced harbor in the world, which was a wonder of the world, the harbor of Carthage. It was a giant circular structure, and they had ports where boats would go in and out, all along a circle, and it is considered to be one of the wonders of the ancient world. They were very great at war. Before Rome challenged them, they were essentially unbeatable. Also, the city of Carthage itself was massive. It had I think they had about several 100,000 people living there, which at the time was incredible. There had never been a city so large when Carthage had appeared. And it was a colony originally, right? It was a colony so great, it made colonies. So these blue areas are areas that were under Carthage's control, including Spain. Most of Hispania was under Carthaginian control, as well as the island of Sicily, and basically the rest of the entire African coast had Carthaginian outposts located all around it. Also, their city, they had so many people in there, they essentially invented apartment blocks. What they had was, they were like, okay, you got a house? Let's stack more houses on top of it. And they even had running water in some of these houses, but only on the first couple of floors, because they hadn't quite figured out how to get running water to reach the top floors yet. But Rome would copy that from them, and then the Romans started building their own apartment blocks. And their navy was something else. It was essentially undefeated. And Rome, when they eventually were fighting Carthage, Rome basically didn't have a navy. And this red area is Rome. Sorry if I didn't mention that. But Rome, being ever inventive, essentially created their own navy that was able to defeat Carthage with Roman ingenuity. So let's move on here. So this is the slide where I'm going to talk about the Punic Wars, which are the wars between Rome, the rising power, and Carthage, the established power. And this war would essentially dictate the fate of the world, because if Rome had been defeated and reduced to insignificance, or conquered by Carthage, Carthage would have created the Carthaginian Empire, I suppose, and the entirety of our civilization wouldn't have been founded on Roman culture and ideals and Latin and all this, it would have been founded on Punic ones, which is quite the alternate history. So the... What are you doing, Dad? You keep telling me to keep the microphone away.
Yeah, it's getting too loud.
No, I think they need to hear me. Anyway, sorry. So Carthage and Rome were having a territorial dispute over Sicily. Half of the island belonged to Rome. Well, not really half, but part of the island belonged to Rome, when the other half belonged to Carthage. So they were in a territorial dispute over the island. So Carthage originally had the advantage in this war because Sicily and Italy are separated by a little strait there. So Carthage could just use their superior navy to block that strait and prevent the Romans from getting reinforcements. But when the Romans had invented their navy, essentially they didn't have one before. They had no real organized navy because they didn't need one. They copied Carthaginian ship designs and used their Roman ingenuity to defeat Carthage, which was thought to be unbeatable at the time. It was quite an impressive victory.
What did they do different?
So, they basically just had more. They're just like, okay, Carthage, you've got 10 ships, I'll build 20. That was Rome's philosophy, was more. We'll just, whatever they have, build twice as many, twice as fast. So, when Rome had defeated Carthage, Carthage owed Rome a lot of money, which is what eventually would end up being the cause of the Second and Third Punic Wars down the line. So Carthage had been humiliated by its defeat by Rome, and after this, the map had changed to where Sicily was owned by Rome, I believe, and all of these islands had become Roman too. However, Carthage is preparing for its revenge. So Carthage fights Rome again, trying to, recapture its former prestige and take back the territories that it had lost. And this time they have a very impressive general. He's almost on the level of Alexander. He's called Hannibal Barca. And you may have heard of him before as well. So what he did was he had a unorthodox invasion route. So instead of just getting on ships and going down the Tiber River to get to Rome would be expecting that. Their defenses would be way too strong. Instead, what he did was take the long way around. So he went all the way through Spain, Gaul, and crossed over the Alps with his army of 500 elephants, which was one of the most impressive things of all time. And he went down all the way here and attacked and got outside Rome's gates, which the Romans would never expect that Carthage would show up outside their gates. They thought that Carthage would just get on their ships and go down the Tiber River to attack Rome. So this is where an expression that you may have heard of comes from called Hannibal is at the gates. And the Romans were so scared of Hannibal that if children were misbehaving, they would say, "Go to bed, Hannibal is at the gates." And they would be like, "No, he's not, but we better go to bed anyway, just in case he is." So they would scare misbehaving children by threatening them with Hannibal. But you see, he didn't invade Rome, he didn't attack Rome, he besieged it, but he was called back to Rome after Rome had dispatched their own forces to Carthage. So Hannibal had to turn around and go back the other way, which was quite disappointing. But you see, Rome defeats Carthage again and forces Carthage to basically become a protectorate. Carthage to basically become a protectorate of Rome. So Carthage loses its ability to declare war independently of Rome. They have to ask Rome to go to war. So Numidia, which is it's not on this map, but it's a region in Africa, the Numidian kingdom, attacked Carthage. So Carthage retaliates. Rome says, "Hey Carthage, I don't remember you asking me to retaliate." So then Carthage is like, oh no. So basically, Carthage gets invaded by Rome a third time, and Rome is so tired of dealing with Carthage, they decide to burn the whole city to the ground and salt the ground so that Carthage would never rise again, which was a brutal act. And if I was them, I probably wouldn't have done that, but that's how it is. But so Rome essentially assumes all of Carthage's territory, and they entirely annexed Carthage, and Carthage ceased to exist. And that's how Rome conquered North Africa, was by eliminating Carthage. And that's where the story of Carthage ends. So this is the Roman Republic. It's not the empire yet, but we'll get to that. So it expands massively. They have conquered all of this. So Greece was brought into the fold of the Roman Empire, mostly because the Romans had viewed the Greeks as their teachers, as they viewed themselves as the inheritors of the Greeks. So they thought that it was their duty to bring the Greeks under their protection, which is why Greece and the western half of Asia Minor have been incorporated into the Roman Empire. And the Greeks were not really angry with this arrangement because, oh, Rome, you're just going to come in and give me free protection and stuff? Oh, great, I don't even have to protect myself anymore. I'm just going to chill now. So they're essentially getting all of this protection for free, really. And when they show up in places like Gaul and Hispania, they bring their advanced engineering and their civilized Latin culture to the previously barbaric tribes. Like they brought the aqueducts, which supplied the city of Rome with running water, and also some other towns too got running water from the aqueducts. The Western Europe, which was previously uncivilized compared to the Middle East and the rest of the ancient world, started receiving its taste of refined Roman ingenuity and culture. However, we have to get to an ugly fact of the Roman Empire. It was based on slavery. The reason why they were able to construct all these impressive things was because they had essentially unlimited free labor. And enslavement was basically when you had been captured as a war captive, and they brought you to the slave market and they sold you. And a great deal of the slaves ended up as state property. So they were the property of the Roman emperor. And they were used to construct the Colosseum or the Pantheon or the aqueducts, which was an unfortunate fact of the Roman Empire, is that the only reason why it became so advanced is because it relied on slavery. And this is going to be one of the main reasons why the Roman Empire eventually fails, is because its entire society was reliant on slavery. And then when Christianity came along, they had to abolish slavery. So when you pull out your economy's entire base, which was free, forced labor, and you abolish it due to moral reasons, suddenly your entire economy falls out from underneath you. And that's how the Roman Empire entered into its decline. One of the reasons was because they had abolished slavery. So we're going to go back to the phalanx a little bit here. We're going to talk about how war was evolving. So the phalanx, which is this square of about 100 men with the sarissas, begins to be replaced by the Romans, which they had been using the phalanx formation. They moved to the maniple formation, which is when you had a bunch of soldiers also get into a block. But instead of being armed with long spears, because that was inflexible, because it was the sarissas and the phalanx was vulnerable from every side except for the front. It was really strong on the front, but weak on all other sides, because it's hard to move a big spear if you're being attacked from the side. So what the Romans did is like, all right, enough with that. We need to find something else that will work. So what they did was they gave all of their guys the full body shields, which were called scutum in Latin, and they armed them with swords, which were called the gladius. And the sword and shield combination in a square was more flexible than the phalanx formation. And with this, the Romans conquered even more. It was essentially the backbone of the Roman military, was organizing your guys into a block, and they had swords and shields instead of a sarissa. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the barbarians, who were essentially the uncivilized tribal people of continental Europe. So we have the Gauls, who were a Celtic tribe, or group of tribes really, there were multiple, that were inhabiting what is now France. So they had advanced metallurgy, they were able to make swords and things out of iron, and they were good enough warriors. I mean, they gave the Romans a hard enough time, especially when Caesar was invading Gaul. But they got conquered by the Romans and became Latinized. And then, well, you see, there's the most important tribe, the one that is most directly responsible for the fall of the Roman Empire, were the Germans, who were incredibly fierce warriors, and they were less civilized compared to the Gauls, so they weren't as soft. You know, they lived hard lives. And they essentially caused the fall of the Roman Empire because they were migrating into the Roman Empire because they were fleeing from the Huns. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And also, they were one of the only barbarian groups to retain their original language and not have it be changed to Latin when they were conquered. So then there were the Hispanians, or the Lusitanians, who are the ancestors of the Spanish and the Portuguese. They spoke a language, or had multiple languages, but one of their languages it later evolved to become Basque, which is a very small language isolate, which is located in Spain. You may have heard of the Basque country and all those things. But Spanish evolved from Vulgar Latin, which was the Latin spoken by the common people. And these later evolved into the different varieties of Spanish and Portuguese. And then there were the Dacians, we don't know a lot about them, but they lived in Pannonia, which was a region in Central Europe, which is now Central Europe or Greater Hungary. But not a lot of them is known.
Why?
Well, because they were conquered by the Romans, and they didn't have writing. So when their culture was conquered and erased by the Romans, it was replaced with the Latin one. They didn't have a lot of writing, so we don't know a lot about them. Then there were the Scythians, who are basically the original Huns, or Mongols. They were a horse tribe from Central Asia, and they ran around on horses, conquering people. They were nomadic. And they lived in what is now Ukraine and Russia. And then the Britannians, who were the Celtic inhabitants of Britain. They interacted with the Romans and became sufficiently civilized. However, when the Angles and Saxons started their migrations to Britain, they became ethnically mixed and created the ancestors of the English. And then the Britons who remained in the West became the Welsh and the Cornish. However, the Roman Republic is starting to fail because it's becoming corrupt. And this starts a theme throughout history that when a republic becomes weak and decadent, it usually becomes replaced by a strong dictator like Julius Caesar. And then the dictator is either able to evolve the system back into a benevolent monarchy, or it collapses and is replaced by another republic. But when the Roman Empire comes around, Rome is able to get past the political troubles of the Roman Republic and usher in a new golden age for Rome. However, we have to talk about the arrival of Christianity, which is going to happen at the end of our period. So when Jesus dies and the Christian church is formed, So the church originally is an underground organization because it is illegal in the Roman Empire. I was talking about how Christians were being executed earlier. Sorry, I need to talk about the map. So these dark blue areas are ones that were converted to Christianity around 300 AD. So it was kind of spread out all over. And then these dark blue areas are ones that would become Christianized by 600, which is the end of our period. What? Oh, I thought somebody was trying to say something, sorry. So the papacy gets established as the successor of St. Peter, and it was based in Rome because that's where he died. And he was martyred on an upside-down cross because he believed that he was not worthy to die in the same way that Jesus did, so he told the Roman soldiers to crucify him upside down. Armenia becomes the first country to convert to Christianity in 301 AD. And Christianity originally was a disrespected minority, and the pagan elites dismissed it as a fad that would quickly go away. But Christianity kept growing because people desired a new religion that would actually give them fulfillment, unlike the stale paganism that was present in the ancient world. And thousands of people were martyred in the Roman Empire during this time. So now we need to talk about the relations between the Latin world and the Greek world. So the Latin and Greek were the two premier languages of the ancient world. And when the Roman Empire starts expanding, Latin becomes more and more prominent in writing. And when Greece was incorporated into the Roman Empire, Greek became the majority language of the east of the empire, and Latin remained the majority language of the west. The Greeks didn't hate this arrangement because the Romans offered them protection, and essentially the relations were going strong. Everybody thought that this was very good. And it laid the foundation for the Latin West and the Greek East in Christendom, which is what we're going to talk about in our next period. So now we're going to talk about when the Roman Empire got converted to Christianity. So Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity after he said that he witnessed a miracle in the sky during a battle. He said that in this painting here, it says that a cross appeared in the sky, and he took this as a sign to convert. So Constantine promulgated the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity, and but it was legalized. That didn't mean it was changed officially. So the majority of the Roman Empire remained pagan, but throughout time, more and more people would be converted. But eventually, the Council of Nicaea would happen, which is when the church fathers were able to define what Christianity actually was, doctrinally speaking. So one of the original heretics, whose name was Arius, he believed that essentially his thesis was that there was a time when Jesus didn't exist, and that he was created by God. But he was defeated at the Council of Nicaea, and however, his doctrines stayed around for a really long time, and a lot of barbarians were converted to the Arian version of Christianity. And then there was the Roman Emperor Theodosius, who finally made Christianity the official religion, removing the last vestiges of paganism. So now we're going to talk about how the Roman Empire got divided, because the Roman Empire was getting too massive to be governed as a united empire. So basically what they did was, all right, Diocletian comes around and he says, all right, so we're going to have the Latin West, so all the Latin-speaking areas will be part of the Roman Empire of the West. And then he says, all right, so the Greek-speaking parts, the eastern area, that will become the Roman Empire of the East. So the empire will be divided for the rest of time. It will never be reunited. But this is what allowed the Roman civilization to continue after the Western Roman Empire went away. It collapsed. So now we're going to talk about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. So more and more barbarian incursions were wearing down the empire. We had invasions from the Huns, and then the Germans were also getting pushed by the Huns into Roman territory because they were being threatened by the Huns. Roman society became decadent, and morality in the pagan elements of Roman society was becoming degenerate. Like, they were having these massive orgy parties where they would just, do these really not good things. I'm not going to go into too much details on what they were doing. Christianity abolished slavery in the Roman Empire, which is what also was leading to its decline, like I stated earlier, because they removed their entire economic base. However, societies based on slavery usually collapse anyway, due to slavery in whole or in part. So the abolishing of slavery probably, it prolonged the existence of the Eastern Roman Empire, but there were other things that were going to destroy the West, like the barbarian invasions. So the Roman Empire of the West lasted until 476 AD, which is considered to be the year that the ancient world ended, when Germanic barbarians sacked Rome, and one of their kings, whose name was Odoacer, proclaimed himself monarch of Italy after the invasion of Rome. So the Roman Empire of the West would not be revived until Christmas Day, 800. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Next presentation. So the Greek Byzantine East continued to exist until the Turks delivered the coup de grace to the to Constantinople in 1453. So you might have heard about the fall of Constantinople in 1453. We're going to talk about that in the next presentation too. So now this is the final slide. We're going to talk about the earliest Middle Ages, so what immediately followed the collapse of the Roman Empire of the West. So the Roman Empire of the West is completely gone. It is replaced by barbarian kingdoms. So you have a lot of these barbarian kingdoms here replacing the empire. The majority of these get converted to Christianity. So there were two versions of Christianity that existed at that time. There was the Latin Church, which was the ancestor of the Catholic Church. And then you have the Arian Church, which is when they followed the doctrines of Arius at the Council of Nicaea, when they believed that Jesus was created by God before he was incarnated instead of being always existing. So the Greek East, however, continued to exist. And it went along relatively unharmed until 600, when the Arab invasions would reduce its territory quite a bit. Hispania is united under a single Visigothic kingdom, and the Visigothic kingdom will last until it's also conquered by the Arabs. The reason why it's called the Visigothic kingdom is because it was dominated by a Germanic tribe that had moved in, called the Visigoths. And then the Franks, who were a tribe that mixed the Gauls. They were an ethnically mixed tribe. They were comprised of Germanic tribes and the Gauls, and they created the Franks. And they have a kingdom, the Frankish kingdom, which is basically the ancestor of all of Western Europe's kingdoms. So it created France and also Germany. Except for Spain, because Spain was dominated by the Visigothic kingdom. So in talk number 2, we're going to be talking about the rise of Islam and the caliphates. We're going to be talking about the European kingdoms, the Viking Age, and the Rus, and where the Slavs came from, the Magyars, who are the Hungarians, and how they evolved from nomadic invaders and became Christians, feudalism and medieval economics, the Middle Ages, how people actually lived back then. It's quite fascinating. The Christian response to Islamic invasions, the early Renaissance, and the fall of the Greek East to the Turks. And that's the end of talk number 1.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. All right, so now we're going to have question time. So if you got questions, I'd just like you to raise your hand and ask questions.
Has anyone here been to Rome? Maybe?
Oh, so you've actually seen the Colosseum and the Pantheon and all those things? Has anybody been to Greece? Oh, you also? Oh, that's very nice. Did you go to the Parthenon? Yeah, that's very, very cool place.
Very hot, long walk.
Yeah, it was quite hot that day when we went too. I think it was about 85 or something. It was pretty hot if you're from Washington, considering that we get rain all the time.
There are there's an interesting YouTube video on Gardens of Babylon as to where they now think it really was.
Uh-huh.
So if anybody wants to do that, you just do it on YouTube, Gardens of Babylon.
Yeah, I think I'll check that out. I think I learned about the Gardens of Babylon from a documentary that I watched with my mom, and she thought it was pretty cool. How they have this massive garden out in the middle of the desert. It was quite an oasis. If you don't have any questions you'd like to ask, I guess this is the end.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Betty Rugen wanted me to make an announcement that she wants to play Mexican dominoes, or domino train, or something dominoes. Mexican train dominoes. If anyone would like to play, she's over there. And then if we head out, we're going to have piano with Robin Myers and root beer floats. And you're welcome.